Senator Romney buys coffee for a shivering stranger, a gesture that changed two lives. Behind the worn blazer hides a former teacher, once the inspiration behind his children's brightest school days. How did a star educator fall into poverty? A mystery buried beneath decades of pain and silence. Devotion to a dying wife. Selling blood to pay for medicine. Pride turned into a curse. Romney, used to solving problems with legislation, now faces the human cost behind the policies. Anonymous acts of kindness, late-night conversations in a corner cafe, and vintage classroom reels where history comes alive. A teacher who lost everything finds new strength in a museum, giving voice to forgotten heroes. A bill, born not in committee chambers, but over the scent of coffee and shared heartache. Two lives, intertwined on a rainy morning, reshape the future of a nation. What matters more, recognition or a quiet act of compassion? And how can one cup of coffee rewrite history? Stay tuned to find out how the story ends. And don't forget to subscribe. The autumn in Salt Lake City breathed a frigid whisper, turning rain into a veil of silver threads that clung to shop windows and tangled into elaborate patterns on the asphalt. Swathed in a gray overcoat of storm clouds, the city seemed muted, as though nature itself had paused, holding its breath in anticipation. On days like this, even the roar of traffic dissolved into the monotonous hiss of water, and people darting under umbrellas became shadows slipping through a half-transparent world. Mitt Romney walked the streets, his dark suit repelling raindrops like a shield against the night sky. But the cold seeped through the seams, a reminder that his joints creaked now, no longer merely knocking. He avoided guarded routes today, a rare moment to feel not the weight of power, but the gravity of his own thoughts. Politics, that endless chess game on a sprawling board, left a metallic tang on his tongue. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored the vibration, silencing the world for an hour. The Café Melchior lurked between a bank and a curio shop, its weathered sign blinking like a neon heart, as if winking at those seeking refuge. Inside, the air smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon, steam swirling to a quiet jazz melody, merging with shadows at the windows. Romney paused at the counter, inhaling a scent that transported him to childhood mornings in Michigan, his mother brewing coffee in a blue enameled pot, seagulls screeching beyond the window. Nostalgia, like that pot, was worn but still warm. His gaze drifted to a man hunched in the corner by the window, not sitting, but shrinking, as if trying to occupy less space in the world. His once dark green suit had faded to swamp muck. Hands gripping an empty mug trembled, not from cold but from something deeper, etched into the veins. His face, mapped with wrinkles like an old chart, dipped low. But when the man's eyes met Romney's, there was no plea, only shame. A shame familiar to anyone who'd lost their grip on life. The senator looked away, feeling for his wallet. The motion was almost instinctual. He nodded to the barista, gestured toward the man, and slid a bill without speaking. For him, something warming. The barista, a woman with pink hair and a bee tattoo on her wrist, smiled, a bittersweet curve. The stranger took the steaming cup, fingers wrapping around ceramic as though absorbing heat through his bones. He didn't say thanks, only nodded slightly, a gesture echoing quiet dignity, like a teacher accepting a student's effort. Romney averted his eyes, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd seen gratitude untethered from transaction. Outside, the rain softened into mist. Romney left his coffee half-finished, leaving a ring on the table like a fossil of the moment. He didn't glance back, but felt the stranger's gaze on his back, a weight of unspeakable stories. The street greeted him with a crisp wind carrying pine from the mountains and a promise of tomorrow's sun. Somewhere distant, a train rumbled. It sounded like a primordial beast's groan, syncing with his pulse. He walked steadily, the cafe vanishing around the corner. But the image of the man, bent yet unbroken, lodged in his memory like a splinter. That night, sorting papers in his office, Romney stumbled on an old photo of his children. They sat on schoolhouse steps, their backs to a linden tree whose shadow hid a teacher's silhouette, pointer in hand. The face was blurred, but the posture, it mirrored the man's in the cafe, spine straight, chin slightly lifted, as if addressing an invisible classroom. His hand trembled, and he set the photo aside, hesitant to connect the fragments already forming a pattern that might upend everything he knew of his past. Beyond the window, the night mirrored the city's lights, 1,000 beacons, each guarding a secret, each waiting to be noticed. A misty morning trailing the storm swaddled the city in a damp shroud. The sun pierced through cloud veils, casting pale glimmers on the asphalt like scattered, dulled coins. Romney returned to Melchior unconsciously. His feet had turned from routine paths, drawn by an unresolved riddle. The café greeted him with the same dance of shadows under a neon heart, but now the air brimmed not just with coffee, but with the weight of unsaid words. Arthur Thompson sat in his corner, his hand still cradling a cup, now steaming with herbal tea, a recommendation from the barista, honeyed and kind. His gaze fixed through the window seemed to pierce the glass, soaking in memories stranded in droplets on the sill. When Romney approached, the man didn't turn his head, but his fingers tightened slightly on the ceramic, betraying tense anticipation. The senator ordered espresso and took a seat across the massive oak table, a barrier between worlds. He watched steam from Arthur's cup merge with his own, forming a fleeting bridge. In profile, the stranger's face was chiseled from stone. Sharp cheekbones, ashen stubble, deep creases at the mouth frozen in a half-smile that no longer fit the present. And then, like a lightning bolt in clear skies, Romney recognized him. Not from a photograph, not from vague memories, but from the way he adjusted his glasses. A fleeting gesture with the index finger, identical to the history teacher his children quoted at dinner tables. Mr. Thompson. The name echoed in his mind like a relic from another era. The very educator who turned the Civil War into an epic of human souls and the Declaration of Independence into a love letter to freedom. The man whose voice, his daughter once said, sounded like a cello in an empty lecture hall. But how had he become this hunched elder whose shirt, once flawlessly pressed, now hung sack-like, its collar mended with clumsy stitches? Romney sipped his coffee, its bitterness mingling with the taste of shame for not recognizing him sooner, for letting years erase that face from memory. Arthur, sensing the weight of the senator's gaze, turned slowly. Their eyes met, and in the teacher's gray depths, a flicker like a falling star, a moment of recognition extinguished by ash-colored resignation. A door slammed at the antique shop next door, its sound like a gunshot shattering the silence. Arthur jumped, spilling tea into a stain resembling a continent. Reaching for a napkin, Romney noticed a scar on his wrist, long and jagged, like the bed of a dried-up river. "Forgive me," Arthur's voice rasped, like a rusted key in a lock. "Old nerves." The words hung in the air, weaving invisible threads of questions. Romney nodded, hesitant to shatter the fragile truce between past and present. Behind the counter, the pink-haired barista cast a curious, wistful glance their way. In the half-hour silence that followed, memories pulsed between them. Romney envisioned his teenage son, usually sullen, animatedly mimicking Mr. Thompson's lesson that history isn't a textbook, it's a mirror reflecting our own faces. He heard his daughter's laughter parodying his Emersonian pre-quiz speeches. There is genius in every man, and we sleep deeper each day. So kids, wake up before it's too late. Yet behind these bright fragments loomed shadows. Arthur's abrupt departure from the school a year before retirement, whispers at PTA meetings. His wife was ill, cancer. Rumor is he mortgaged the house. Romney had tuned it out. Governor's duties, campaigns, a world revolving around him like the Earth's axis. Now, watching Arthur fold an empty sugar packet into a tiny triangle, a habit from days teaching Napoleon's campaigns through geometric strategy, the senator felt a searing awkwardness. He wanted to ask, to offer help, to unleash the polished rhetoric of political debates. But his tongue stuck to his palate, sealed by the silence Arthur guarded like a fortress. When Romney stood to leave, their eyes met again. This time, in the teacher's gaze flickered an old pride, an ember whispering, "I'm still here." Beneath the ruins, still here. Outside, wind scattered clouds, and a sunbeam pierced through, striking the antique shop window. Among porcelain dolls and tarnished silver candlesticks sat a book, a tattered volume of Emerson. On an open page, a line underlined, "Even in the darkest corridors of fate, there's always a door to light. But to find it, you must stop fearing the dark." Romney paused, reading the words. Inside, a chair creaked. Arthur was rising. His shadow briefly merged with Romney's silhouette on the pavement, two worlds touching to remind him, fall and rise are mere dots on time's spiral. He walked toward his office but veered instead to the public library. In the archives, beneath dust and age-scented vaults, he requested decade-old newspaper clippings. Fingers paused on a tiny personal thanks announcement. Teacher Arthur Thompson thanks students and colleagues for support during a difficult time. The date matched the month, per school rumors, when his wife began losing her battle to illness. That evening, sorting documents, he found a letter from his daughter in college. At the end, after tales of lectures and parties, a casual postscript. "Mr. Thompson left today. They say he sold his library to pay for something. We tried fundraising, but he returned the envelope. Said nobility isn't taking, but giving, even when you have nothing to give." Rain tapped the window again, but now each drop, striking the glass, echoed the ticking of a clock counting down to the moment when coincidence ceases to be coincidence and becomes destiny waiting its turn. Senator Romney's home in the Wasatch foothills held silence like a relic. Autumn wind rustled the pages of forgotten books on shelves where volumes on political science and founding fathers' biographies sat beside a tattered textbook, History Through Unseen Eyes. Dust clung to its cover, but the daughter's childhood inscription showed through. "Mr. T said this is our Bible. Without sin, just truth." The senator lifted it, and the pages automatically opened to a chapter on 18th century underground presses, where his son's doodle grinned back, a caricature of Benjamin Franklin labeled "Genius Who Invented Taxes." "Thanks for the lesson, Dad." The scent of lavender from the garden mingled with old ink, and suddenly the room swelled with echoes of the past. Walls dissolved, revealing the classroom of 2003, sunlight dancing in time with Arthur Thompson's pointer. That Arthur stood at the chalkboard, his jet-black suit contrasting with the silver just beginning to streak his temples. His hand inscribed dates not as numbers, but as symphonic notes. 1775 wasn't a shot, it was a child's cry born in agony. 1787, the first step when the Constitution became a promise, not a document. His voice rippled like a brook over stones, making even distracted teens forget their texts. "Your ancestors didn't sign declarations." He turned to the class, locking eyes with Romney's daughter, breathless at the third desk. They were declarations. Every choice, a letter, every act, a clause. "And you're still rough drafts." Laughter rolled, but Arthur raised a hand. "Rough drafts are sacred. You can scrub out lies before they become history." Romney, then governor, lingered at the door unseen, a ghost of the future. He watched his slouched teenage son straighten under Thompson's words. "George Washington lost more battles than your iPhones can endure." But he knew, defeat is just a story no one's finished writing yet. Decades later, the senator traced his children's scribbles, seeking a thread between that Arthur and the man in the café. A bookmark fluttered, a clipping from the school paper. Arthur surrounded by students at a veterans memorial. "Mr. Thompson, the man who makes stones speak." On the back, his daughter's tiny script. "He brought Vietnam soldiers letters. We cried, even Jacob." A clock tolled in the house, bronze echoes returning Romney to the present. At the window, a maple shed leaves like charred pages. He recalled 2009, his daughter, sleepless before graduation, whispering, "Mr. T is leaving." They say his wife, but a Senate crisis rang. Their conversation snapped, a chapter half read. The day after meeting Arthur in Melchior, Romney visited the school. The once brick red building had faded to terracotta, and the door to room 214 now bore a "Do Not Enter" testing in progress sign instead of "History is You." Through the glass, walls stripped of Thoreau quotes and Harriet Tubman portraits displayed achievement charts, their yellow and green bars resembling barcodes, not victories. The director, a man with a rehearsed smile, hesitated. Thompson? Oh, the old guy. Left for personal reasons. Still, he leaned in, as if confessing an illness. His methods were outdated. Now we focus on digital analytics, not emotions. Romney wandered the abandoned Assembly Plaza, where Arthur once staged living lessons. Students in 19th century garb debating Lincoln Douglas. Now it littered with plastic cups, a spray-painted history sucks glowing on the asphalt. His phone buzzed, a reminder of a lobbying meeting. Instead, he drove to the city archives. In a mildew-scented basement, he found 2012 school board minutes. Arthur Thompson requests unpaid leave. Reason, caring for terminally ill spouse. A marginal note. Consider fundraising, denied against bylaws. That night, sorting papers, he found an envelope of childhood drawings, thank you cards his kids never delivered. One depicted Arthur as an oak with book leaves. His son wrote, "Your roots. Roots are invisible, but without them, we're dust." Under a full moon, Romney walked to an old gazebo in the garden, where his children had hidden a time capsule for Arthur. Open when you become him. Inside, letters wrapped in foil. His daughters read, "You taught us silence is a voice, but how to be silent when you're leaving is a scream." He sat on the cold bench, feeling the stone drink his warmth. A coyote howled in the valley, its cry merging with a siren's wail. The city slept, unaware its laws, like those textbooks, lost pages. At dawn, he returned to Melchior. Arthur was gone, replaced by a student poring over a chemistry textbook. A crumpled napkin on the table sketched a tree with severed roots. The barista handed him a letter. "He asked you take this. Said he's going to the doctor." A library map marked the American Diary section. Between ancient folios, Romney found a leather-bound journal. Arthur's wife, Eleanor's, final entry, dated a week before her death. Arthur sold his father's watch to buy morphine. I told him pain was my last lesson. He cried like a boy losing his compass. As sunset crimsoned the city, Romney exited the library. Downstairs, Arthur sat on a park bench, feeding pigeons crumbs from a paper bag. Each toss was deliberate, ritualistic, a penance in slow motion. A pioneer monument's shadow fell between them, dividing the moment into before and after. Romney understood. Arthur needed no pity. He demanded a witness, one who'd see how the history he dedicated his life to was a puzzle missing its keystone. Romney turned and walked away, not to his car, but along the canal where water carried fallen leaves into underground tunnels. His phone buzzed, a tool to rally funds, call a press conference, change everything. But first, he had to change himself, stop reading history, and start writing it. The mist rising from the canal wrapped the city in a milky white shroud, turning morning into a blurred watercolor. Romney walked along the waterfront, where streetlights, still flickering after the night, glowed like winking lanterns from childhood dreams. In his hand, he clutched Eleanor Thompson's tattered journal. Her words burned his palm as if the pages were soaked not in ink but in the caustic sting of shame. Melchior greeted him with silence, broken only by the hiss of steam from the coffee machine. Arthur sat by the window, his table now crowded with books, worn volumes on art history, collections of Dickinson's poetry, a star atlas. He was bent over a sheet of paper, writing with a fountain pen whose once white nib had yellowed with age. Romney froze, watching a sunbeam pierce the fog and glide across the spines of the books, each stamped with library marks from different states. He's still learning, even when the world has taken everything. The senator approached, disturbing the fragile balance of quiet. Arthur didn't look up but gestured toward the chair, as if he'd been expecting the visit. An open book lay between them, Rousseau's Confessions, bookmarked with a dried maple leaf. "You knew," Romney began, placing the journal on the table, "that Eleanor wrote about you as a boy who'd lost his compass?" The pen halted above the paper, leaving a blot that looked like a tiny constellation. Arthur reached for his mug, but instead of tea, it held water, clear as his futile attempt to hide the truth. "A compass," his voice creaked like old floorboards, "points to magnetic north. But what if your north is a person and they walk away?" He leaned back. And in that motion flickered the shadow of the teacher he once was, the one who could explain the fall of empires through the lens of love. His hand drifted to the left pocket of his blazer, where medals for teaching excellence once rested. Now, only a tear remained, stitched with rough, uneven seams. Romney flipped the journal open to a random page. Eleanor's words danced before his eyes. Today Arthur sold his coin collection. Said the Caesar on the denarius was glaring at him anyway. But I see how he strokes the empty box before bed. Arthur spoke suddenly, as if addressing not the senator but the ghost of his wife, drifting between the café shelves. She forbade loans, said debt's a plague that'll outlive us both. His fingers clenched the mug until his knuckles paled. But what do you call money taken from your own body? 3 years I gave blood. Plasma, $50. Whole blood, $80. One nurse asked, "You're a teacher, aren't you?" I said, "No, a student. Learning the price of red blood cells in grams of D." Romney tightened around his throat. He recalled healthcare reform debates where he'd wielded numbers like weapons, average palliative care costs, percentage of families losing their homes, but those numbers had no faces. Now, one sat across from him, needle scars in the crook of his arm, eyes faded from sleepless nights beside a dying bed. Arthur reached for a book, opening it to the chapter on the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. In the margins, a child's handwriting scrawled, "Mr. T said the slaughter didn't start with knives but with silence. I won't be silent anymore. Dad, ask Mom how her day was. Romney's daughter, 2006. They wrote you things like this," Arthur whispered, "and you read them?" The senator tried to answer, but the words stuck in his throat, thick as unshed tears. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the brick wall of an antique shop. In its window, a dusty globe stood, cracked across the Pacific, splitting the world into before and after. Arthur rose, his shadow stretching across the wall, merging with the silhouette of the young teacher from Romney's memories. He pulled a key from his pocket, hanging on a worn cord, the one that once unlocked a classroom door. "After she died, I went back to school," he said, twisting the key in the air as though turning an invisible lock. "But my lessons became dangerous. I told kids war happens when politicians forget math. One life not equal two life. They asked me to leave. Not officially, of course. The principal just flinched whenever I said conscience." Romney remembered meeting that same principal, his talk of outdated methods. Now those words had a taste, bitter as quinine. Arthur moved to the window, pressing his palm against the glass, watching the city wake, oblivious to the dramas unfolding behind its panes. "Do you know hunger?" he asked without turning. "Not the growl in your stomach, the kind that gnaws at your soul when you sell a book and realize there's not a single line left in your world to sustain you." He turned, and Romney saw the teacher he'd once been, the one who turned lessons into confessions. "Your kids once asked, why don't textbooks name the ones who carried the wounded after battles?" I told them. "Because history's written in ink and erased with blood." But I was wrong. It's erased with silence. The sun, climbing higher, spilled light onto Eleanor's journal. On the open page, Romney caught a note. "Arthur writes letters to Congress at night," says one voice crying into the void is madness. 1,000? Statistics. He wants to be the bridge between them. The barista brought a fresh kettle. Arthur poured 2 cups, his hand trembling, but the ritual held the grace of a Japanese tea ceremony. "You'll ask why I never came to you." He lifted his cup, watching the steam curl into the sunbeam. "I was afraid you'd see a problem, not a person. And problems get solved with money, advice, hollow words in transcripts." Romney opened his mouth to argue, but Arthur raised a hand. "Don't. This morning I saw you reading that journal by the fountain. Your eyes, they softened." Her words got through. From the book, Arthur drew out a dried rose, brittle as parchment. "Eleanor's last gift," she said. "In a prison without walls, pride is the warden. Take it." He held out the flower. "Someday it'll remind you that even senators are just people. And people." The hum of street traffic swallowed the end of the sentence. Romney took the rose, feeling its fragility, like holding a human soul in his palm. When he stepped outside, the fog had fully burned away, revealing a city that suddenly felt like a vast classroom, where everyone was both student and teacher. His phone buzzed in his pocket, an aide reminding him of a meeting with oil executives. Instead, Romney turned toward the park, where kids fed ducks and old men played chess with sets missing their kings. Seated on a bench, he unfolded the rose. Tucked between its petals was a slip of paper, Eleanor's words, rewritten in Arthur's hand. Sometimes to find yourself, you must let another lose themselves in you. The wind swept the petals toward the canal, where the water, catching the sky's reflection, turned briefly as blue as that enamel pot from childhood. Romney closed his eyes, feeling the boundaries between past and present, power and humanity, dissolve into a single truth. Even senators cry. Quietly, unseen, like autumn rain washing away footprints in the sands of time. Winter crept into Salt Lake City overnight, dusting the mountains with a frosting of frost. The streets, still breathing autumn's melancholy yesterday, now chimed underfoot like crystal chandeliers. Romney stood by the window of his office, watching snowflakes, tiny hexagonal verses, melt against the warm glass. In his hand, he held the same dried rose, its petals as fragile as papyrus, whispering a story that could never make it into a Senate committee report. On the desk, between folders labeled urgent, lay a black notebook. Inside were calculations unlike budget charts, the monthly cost of palliative care, the price of antidepressants, a list of charities for former teachers. He'd started it the night rain tapped against the window in a rhythm that echoed the ticking of a metronome above Eleanor's bed. The assistant who peeked in with coffee didn't ask questions. The shadow on the wall, a profile of Arthur, cut from a newspaper article about a school closure, said the first step was anonymously paying for a rental apartment. Romney chose not a luxury complex, but an old brick house at the foot of the canyon, where the windows faced a pine forest. The realtor passed the keys through the barista at Melchior, the same pink-haired girl whose bee tattoo now seemed like a symbol of quiet work outside the hive of power. Arthur accepted the gift in silence. The next day, in the book-cluttered coffee shop, volumes on quantum physics stacked high. To understand how time can be both healer and executioner, he left an envelope on Romney's table. Inside was a 1945 photograph, a crowd in Times Square, a kissing couple, and a childlike arrow scribbled in pen. Not them. Us. The senators started arriving at Melchior earlier than usual. They'd sit in the corner, separated by towers of books, like two archaeologists excavating civilizations buried beneath layers of pain. Arthur explained chaos theory using falling leaves. Romney spoke about amendments to the education bill. Their dialogue flowed in half hints, where the most important words remained unspoken. One morning, Romney found a box on his desk in the Senate. Inside was an old projector with film reels. The first reel showed Arthur's classroom, kids in 19th century costumes reenacting Andrew Jackson's trial, the teacher himself as judge, quoting Jefferson. The second reel captured an empty auditorium. The camera trembled, zooming in on a chair draped with a woman's shawl. Arthur's voice off-screen said, "History is also the empty spaces, like this shawl." It belonged to a woman who sewed banners for an underground newspaper in 1968. You won't find her name in textbooks. Romney ordered the films digitized. When the technician asked, "For the archives?" he replied, "For the future." By Christmas, Arthur stopped hiding his scars. He came in wearing a sweater Eleanor had knitted, a pattern of maple leaves wrapping his chest like her arms once had. One day, sorting through a box of children's letters, he handed Romney a note. "From your son, 2008. Mr. T, today you said heroes are the ones who see cracks in the world and aren't afraid to look inside. Dad says you meant politicians, but I think you meant us. Thanks for breaking the mirror so we could see the shards of truth." That night, Romney couldn't sleep. He stepped into the garden, where snow sparkled under the moonlight like a billion microscopic diamonds. In his pocket was for retired teacher support, gathering dust in a drawer for 10 years. The ink on its pages mingled with shadows from bare branches, forming new words. Dignity isn't a privilege, it's the right to remembrance. In the morning, he sent a letter to the Forgotten Voices Foundation, enclosing half his quarterly salary. In the purpose field, he wrote, "For those who teach us to see the cracks." Hearing about it from the barista, Arthur sent back a postcard featuring Raphael's The School of Athens. On the reverse, he'd written, "Plato was wrong. The perfect state doesn't start with philosophers in power. It starts with teachers who don't have to sell their blood for textbooks." On New Year's Eve, Romney found a basket outside his office door. Inside was Eleanor's old thermos, wrapped in pages torn from a diary with a note. She'd want you to drink real coffee, not the sludge they serve you in meetings. He poured the coffee into a mug the kids had given him, "World's Best Dad Senator," and realized bitterness isn't a flavor, it's the absence of those who once turned it into wisdom. The city glowed with string lights, but Romney turned toward Arthur's house. The second-floor window was lit, a shadow flickering behind the curtain, bent over a book. He didn't knock. Instead, he left a bundle on the porch, the first set of digitized reels and a copy of the bill, with a note scrawled on the title page. Co-author, the man who taught me to read between the lines. On the walk home, the snow began to melt, revealing sidewalks where green shoots stirred beneath the ice, future spring breaking through. Romney recalled Emerson's words Arthur had once quoted in class, "Even in the longest night, there are stars visible only to those unafraid to look up." So he looked up. Above the city, Orion shimmered against the velvet sky. Not a hunter now, but a teacher, pointer in hand. "Look, kids, these aren't just stars. They're tombstones of forgotten stories. Your job is to give them a voice." His phone buzzed in his pocket. The assistant reminding him about his New Year's address. Romney switched it off, for the first time in 20 years allowing himself to be just a person, the kind whose footprints in the snow led not to a podium but to a house scented with cinnamon and waiting coffee, undiluted by pragmatism. And far off, in Melchior's window, a neon heart flickered in sync with the city's ticking clocks, counting down the seconds to a moment when random kindness would become law, and law would become humanity. Spring arrived in Salt Lake City like an artist determined to paint over winter's gray strokes with watercolor blossoms. The air shimmered with the scent of lilacs, and the mountain peaks, still dusted with snow, looked like giant pages where the melting ice traced lines of renewal. Romney walked along the path to the Capitol, but instead of a tie, he wore a scarf. A gift from Arthur, woven from wool dyed in the hues of sunsets Eleanor had loved to describe in her journal. Melchior Coffee had replaced its neon heart with a new sign, an open book with steam rising from its spine. Inside, among the usual crowd, school kids now scribbled Thoreau quotes into their notebooks, while retirees debated Stoic philosophy. Arthur, once the corner sage, no longer shrank into the window seat. His table overflowed with letters, thank you notes from former students sharing how his lessons had helped them weather loss, find courage, or simply see the stars through the city's haze. One morning, Romney found a newspaper on his office doorstep. The front page featured a photo of Arthur standing at the entrance to the Historical Museum, where he now worked as a consultant. The headline read, "The Teacher Who Reminded a Nation of Its Humanity." The article spoke less about the senator and more about the everyday hero whose life had become a bridge between politics and people. At the bottom, fine print, it noted, "Inspiration credited to an anonymous benefactor." Romney smiled, imagining Arthur squirming as he read it, adjusting his glasses with that familiar gesture, the one that once made classrooms fall silent in anticipation of wisdom. He rolled up the newspaper but didn't toss it. Instead, he placed it in a frame next to a photo of his children on their school's front steps. Barely visible in the background stood the silhouette of a teacher holding a pointer. The museum had become Arthur's new sanctuary. Visitors passing through the Civil War exhibit often found him by the case of soldiers' letters. He didn't lecture, he told stories about a young man writing home about nightingales mistaken for gunfire, about a field doctor sketching flowers in the margins of his diary to stay sane. Children pressed their hands to the glass, as if they could reach through and shake hands with the past brought to life by Arthur's voice. Romney visited the museum incognito. Standing in, he listened as Arthur explained the meaning of a worn medallion to a teenager. See that scratch? That's not damage. It's the fingerprint of a woman who dropped it while rushing her children from a fire 150 years ago. History isn't objects, it's fingerprints left on time. After the tour, Arthur headed toward the exit, where an elderly couple waited. The woman, her hands trembling, offered an envelope. "You taught my father. He died in poverty, but he kept your notes." Arthur accepted the envelope without opening it, sliding it into the pocket beside the key to a long-demolished classroom. Through the crowd, his gaze met Romney's, a silent nod, barely perceptible but rich with understanding. The next day, Romney introduced a new bill in the Senate. The press dubbed it the Dignity Act. It proposed more than just benefits. It called for community centers for retired teachers, places where they could share knowledge instead of struggling alone, like Arthur now did at the museum. During his speech, the senator mentioned no names. Instead, he played a digitized film reel, a 2005 classroom reenactment of a debate between Jefferson and a modern teenager. The final line lingered in the chamber. Freedom isn't just the right to speak, it's the duty to listen. The room erupted in applause. Romney saw only one face, Arthur's, watching the broadcast from the museum. He turned away toward the window, but the senator knew the teacher was smiling. That evening, back at Melchior, Romney found a copy of Emerson's essays waiting on his usual seat. Inside the cover, a handwritten note read, "Thank you for the second lesson." The first was how to be a teacher. The second, how to be human. Next to the book sat a steaming mug of coffee, its rising vapor curling into shapes that resembled mountain ridges. Romney stepped outside, where streetlights flickered to life one by one, like stars descending from the sky to hear the city's stories. His phone buzzed in his pocket, donors, reporters, staffers, but he ignored it, heading instead toward the canyon. There, the pines, old enough to remember the first Mormon settlers, that true change begins not with speeches, but with quiet acts like streams carving stone. At the trailhead, Arthur waited. They climbed to an overlook where the city spread out like a mosaic of lights, each one a life, a struggle, a hope. The silence between them spoke louder than words, echoing with the voices of Eleanor, their students, and those who had once lost faith but found it again. Arthur handed Romney a smooth, time-worn stone. From Lake Michigan, Eleanor used to say stones like this were the earth's tears turned to wisdom. Romney closed his hand around the stone, feeling its weight, as light as a feather, as heavy as legacy. He knew it would sit on his desk beside the dried rose and children's letters, not as a keepsake but as a reminder, even senators are just students in life's vast classroom. On the way down, they passed Melchior. The neon heart now glowed constantly, and a sign in the window read, "Where Stories Begin." Romney stepped inside. Among the photos pinned to the wall was a candid snapshot, him and Arthur outside the museum, unaware they'd been photographed. Someone had scribbled beneath it, "Thank you for proving heroes wear sweaters, not robes." Later at home, flipping through Eleanor's journal, Romney found an unfamiliar entry, her handwriting, but written by his hand. Sometimes one act is like caffeine for the soul. You wake up and realize the world hasn't changed, but you have, and that's enough. He closed the journal. Outside, Orion burned in the dark sky, no longer a hunter, but a teacher, pointing his starry rod at silent, eternal lessons of light. And below, in the city, the story of two men who found each other in autumn rain continued to grow, embroidered by legend but grounded in truth. That even in a world of laws and numbers, there is always room for a cup of coffee offered without agenda. Sometimes that's enough to rewrite the script of an entire life, without applause but forever.